Sawadee-krap. Hello, good afternoon from Bangkok, from Chulalongkorn University campus, the Institute of Security and International Studies, ISIS Thailand. My name is Thitinan Pongsuthirath. I will be moderating this public forum today. We have a public forum on a very topical issue, very much pressing, the Russia-Ukraine war and prospects, the impact for world order and implications for Asia. We have a lineup of speakers. I want to thank all of them. First of all, Dr. Viktor Sumsky, who is in Moscow, joining us in the morning, and then Dr. Volodymyr Slovyan, who is in Kiev, Ukraine, joining us also in the morning, and my colleagues in Bangkok, Dr. Jitipat Poonkam and Dr. Nathanan Punamat. I'll introduce them one by one as their turn to speak comes up. In the meantime, let me just briefly lay the scene or set out the scene a little bit. We have now in the world a war in Europe. This is astonishing, and I think it's very alarming to a lot of people, and it affects many countries and societies, and is in the global headlines all the time. It's now in the second week of this war, so we are very much concerned about how it began, what's going to happen next. It affects us adversely all the way over here in Thailand, which is part of Southeast Asia. So our audiences in the region are really puzzled. I'll just tell our speakers from Moscow and Kiev that we want to make sense of what's happening, what's going on. I know the feelings are running very high. This is a very highly charged environment. People have very strong feelings, strong reactions, because lives are being lost. A lot of damages are being registered, being inflicted. So we want to know what's happening and where is this all going, and if at all, how it might come to an end. So the first speaker, Dr. Sumsky, and our second speaker, Dr. Slovyan. I'll just tell you a little bit about where we're coming from here in Bangkok. The Russia situation with Ukraine and all this kind of European dynamics, the EU, NATO. This has been in the news, been around. In fact, before this crisis became a war, we were even talking in class, on the university campus in class about what's happening as a kind of a international relations discussion in class. And I even assigned my students to read Dmitry Trenin's article in Foreign Affairs about what Putin really wants in Ukraine. So there's an academic debate, and we're trying to learn, to understand. But then the crisis, really felt like a crisis when Russia recognized the republics in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk. Once that happened, this became kind of a crisis on what happens next, because it raised the political temperature, global political temperature, immediately, instantly. So then, we had a crisis, and then a few days later, there was an outright invasion, military movement into Ukraine. And now there's a war. Russia's military actions in Ukraine into the second week now. So, it's no longer an academic debate that we had about Russia's grievances, as Dmitry Trenin described very well about, the eastward expansion of NATO, the aspired membership of within the EU of Ukraine, Ukraine's aspiration to join the EU and NATO and so on. Once the invasion began, it changed everything. It changed everything, because now we have a war at hand. And I think, we're all affected by this war. So, Dr. Sumsky, in that light, with that backdrop, I want to come to you first. Just for our audience members, I just say that Dr. Viktor Sumsky is not a stranger in our regional think tank network. He has been in the past executive secretary of the CSCAP. CSCAP is a kind of a track 1.5, track 2 think tank forum to promote stability, cooperation, security in the Asia Pacific and across Asia. So Dr. Sumsky has been known for not just ISIS Thailand, but also to think tanks in Jakarta, in KL, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, and so on. And he's come to visit this region on a regular basis prior to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So just to say that not a stranger, and just to say that we worked with him before in the region. And now I want to just say a little bit more. He is the Dr. Sumsky is a founding director of ASEAN Center at Mingmo University, MFA of Russia, and he has a doctorate in history. Apart from the CSCAP executive secretary, he also has lectured widely in international universities and so on. And today, thank you for agreeing to join us. We want to have a view from Moscow. How did this crisis, become a war? And if you can give us also a sense of the dynamics on the ground where you are in your country, and what might be the kind of an end game or circumstances and conditions that could lead us to the end of this war, to get out of this war, to stop this war. So, Dr. Sumsky, maybe that's a first a round of remarks from you, 6 to 8 minutes or so, and then we'll come back to you again after that. Please go ahead, Dr. Sumsky, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Titinen. I would not pretend, of course, to cover the whole ground and all the questions you outlined in 6 to 7 minutes. I want to make just several introductory remarks. Let me start by saying that ASEAN expert community is certainly aware, at least since 2013-2014, of what is looming in Ukraine. In 2014, in the middle of that year, I remember very well how I listened in KL at the annual Asia-Pacific Roundtable to a powerful presentation by Harike Usikan, one of the most sophisticated observers and analysts of the regional and global scene in Southeast Asia, who was personally present in Kiev in December 2013 during the so-called Maidan revolution, and who delivered a talk to which I could probably fully subscribe in terms of very realistic vision of how it all became possible and where it may lead to. At the end of that year, I was involved in a project to produce a forecast for Russia and the world in the year 2020. And in my chapter on where Southeast Asia may be going at that time, I had a section which was called the possible impact of the Ukrainian crisis on the Asia Pacific. I actually think now about, this is the book, and I think about republishing that part of my piece somewhere to present it as an example of a forecast which materialized. Interestingly, though, during this whole period, I haven't sensed so much concern about what's happening in Ukraine or what might happen in Ukraine as related to Asia and ASEAN in particular. ASEAN seemed very much at that time, and in some ways, even until today, in a state of mood which distinguished international policy theoretician Hans Morgenthau described once as strategic narcissism when he was talking about the United States, meaning that the United States tends to look at the world only through the prism of its own interests. So when I apply this term to ASEAN, I basically mean that ASEAN was fully consumed with itself, with its wonderful achievements, and these achievements were really wonderful. I do not dispute it. What I dispute is only this tendency to do not look much further than your own achievements and your own objectives, and at some points even give an impression that the whole world is created just to secure your success and to make it all happen. We were listening to these endless mantras about how wonderful is that diplomatic style which is called the ASEAN way, how the world, how inevitably the East Asian region will become the global center of gravity for all sorts of economic activities, and how ASEAN is now implementing in a very confident way what has been known as ASEAN centrality. Of course, as time went by, more and more people were seeing a huge cloud on the horizon, which was the sharpening US-China rivalry. But many still preferred to focus not so much on the dangers of this emerging and developing rivalry, but on the fact that there was a silver lining to this cloud, which was economic interdependency. Even Belakari Kuusikan himself preferred to look at it that way until very recently, saying that real Cold War will never be possible between the United States and China because of economic interdependency. And he was saying this in the twilight of the Trump era. So if he was taking that point of view, what to speak of the others? And now we come, and now we are in February and March 2022, when ASEAN, somewhat reluctantly, has to subscribe to the resolution of the extraordinary session of the United Nations Assembly, which is condemning Russia for what it has been doing in Ukraine in the last few days, as if 15 years back, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many Russians, and maybe for a somewhat shorter period of time, from 2014 up till now, it was not already very evident where the events are moving. And it was not also evident that Russia is seeking diplomatic solutions to this very painful situation. And you'll find the proof in the well-known Minsk agreements, which were the guarantors of which were Germany and France. The narrative of that resolution, and of many things that you will find on the social media network. You want to say something? Sorry.
Yes, sorry, Dr. Sumsky, very good. I think we would like to kind of maybe home in and focus now on the war itself. The ASEAN votes, you mentioned, it was a bit mixed. I think Laos and Vietnam abstained, but the others, this was an overwhelming vote in the UNGA, by the way, to condemn Russia for this aggression against Ukraine's resolutions. Even Cambodia voted in favor. So this war is really, I have to say, Dr. Sumsky, that it's not very popular internationally. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why this war. The narrative about the grievances, the NATO expansion, and all of that, going back to 2014, the Maidan Revolution, the overthrow of the previous Ukrainian government, that's all within this narrative. But this narrative really changed and took a very different turn after February 24th with the invasion. So maybe please tell us a little bit about why are we doing this? Why are we here with the war?
Dr. Titian, I have to say very frankly that I strongly disagree with you that the old narrative is gone. What we witness is the culmination of that narrative, because what's happening between Russia and Ukraine would never be possible without the position taken by NATO, without what happened in in early 2014 in Kiev, where they had basically a coup d'etat, and where the guarantors of the previously concluded sort of peace agreement between the Ukrainian government and the opposition was France, Poland, and Germany basically betrayed their signatures as guarantors of that agreement. Now, again, I think a lot of what happened later on in Ukraine, including the incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation, is on the one hand well known, but on the other hand seem to be not connected at all with what happened later on, and what we had during the last 8 years in these areas, in these former areas of eastern Ukraine, which are now acknowledged by Russia as independent republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. Can you imagine that the war has been already underway for 8 years in that particular area, and that Russia displayed incredible patience in view of incessant and merciless artillery shelling of civilians and major cities of this part of the country, which is basically populated by Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. So, Russia went into all sorts of diplomatic efforts to avoid going into what it was called to do, passionately called to do by the people inhabiting these regions. So I would say it very plainly that what Russia is practicing today, we call it war. In Western terms, there are so many reasons to call it what you would call responsibility to protect. That's what Russia is doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, we take that what you said, basically, this is a continuation. So this war for you, from the Russian perspective, as expressed from you, is kind of a continuation of the agreement, the Minsk agreement, and then maybe the sense of how that agreement was betrayed, and that's why the continuation of the policy into this war. Let me just, Dr. Sumsky, if you could just bear with me a little bit. Let me bring in Dr. Slovjan. Dr. Slovjan, you're sitting in Kiev in Ukraine, and I'm sure Dr. Slovjan, by the way, is a research fellow at the New Geopolitics Research Center. He has a PhD in philosophy. He's been involved in think tanks, having done a lot of publications on the Black Sea and Eastern Europe. So an expert in his own right. Dr. Slovjan, from where you are, what's the outlook from Ukraine in reaction, of course, to the ongoing war and conflict and crisis, but also, this. Were you surprised, you and your colleagues, by this invasion? And what is? How do you see the handling of the situation on the ground, and what do you see as the prospects ahead in the coming days, Dr. Slovjan?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. To start with, I'd like to mention that right now I'm in Kiev, and for the 9th day in a row, I'm hearing every day how our Ukrainian anti-aircraft warfare down Russian missiles, and I don't feel unsafe. And this is the same how feel today millions of Ukrainians. So it's quite uneasy for me to stay cool-headed, and after all, but I will try to present my view, and of course to answer many stamps of Russian propaganda that I have heard recently from Mr. Sumsky. To start with, I'd like to to begin with some points about how things are going on in Ukraine. So, as you all know, the armed forces of Ukraine and Ukrainian people have been resisting new and new attacks by the Russian occupiers in various directions. And this war is absolutely unprovoked and have no justification. The Russian occupiers are using methods that violate the rules of law. Russian occupiers continue rocket and artillery shelling of civilian buildings. They attack civilian infrastructure, killing and injuring civilians, including children, and regional and international consequences. So every day Ukraine lost many people, and right now more than 2,000 civilians were killed. And I don't know how this can be compared with what we was witnessing on the Donbass during the last 8 years. The Russian occupiers use weapons prohibited by the Geneva Convention to strike Ukrainian cities. There are many evidences of Russian troops dropped vacuum bombs and cluster bombs. But as we may see, Putin's blitzkrieg failed. Russia has failed to sack Kyiv within several days and liquidate Mr. Zelensky, Ukrainian president. On the operational level, there are no rapid breakthroughs, and Ukrainian forces continue active defense. And on the several directions, Russian troops were stopped, and among them is quite low morale. According to Pentagon's estimates, Russia invaded with almost 90% of its of the whole units that it gathered around Ukrainian borders during the last months. And from US perspective, it's a seen that Russia is weakened in military dimension. As well, according to these estimates, Russia right now does not put more troops towards Ukrainian direction, so it's hard to predict how far Russians will advance. Also, Russian troops are running out of gas on highways and get stuck in the mud. There are many videos in social media that is an evidence of problems with logistics and fueling of Russian war gears. Also, Russian soldiers are robbing houses and looking for food. Then I may say that Russia appears to be taking incredible battlefield losses, possibly more than 300 troops so far, according to conservative estimates by Western officials. Ukrainian estimates tells us that Russia lost twice bigger amount of soldiers. Also, Russia lost more than 200 tanks and 300 armored vehicles. This is the biggest losses that Russia had since the World War II. I just like to tell that during the Afghan war, during almost 9 years, Russia lost 15,000. So the war in Ukraine is one of the bloodiest, and maybe will become the bloodiest conflict in the Europe since the World War II. What was the reason? From my point of view, the main reason is that Putin and his cronies are making decisions based on Putin's historical views and the views of Russia's superiority, not on the facts. We are all dealing with a fanatical, fascist zealot, not a rational, democratic elected leader. the Kremlin's pre-war calculations were totally based from reality. They were fanatics. I may say that Russian leadership does not understand how Ukraine developed during the last 8 years, and Putin personally does not understand Ukraine, absolutely. He is calling Ukraine Russian historical territories, but he don't know the Ukrainians. He tells us from the TV screen that Russians and Ukrainians are the one nation. It's totally false. I am a new generation of Ukrainians. I was born in independent state, and I can't imagine to be the one nation with Russians. They have absolutely another political culture, and I have an experience of living in Soviet Union, so it's unimaginable for me how one madman in Kremlin is destroying my country, destroying economy of my country and future of millions of Ukrainians. As for today, we have more than 1 million refugees. Many facilities, civil infrastructure was destroyed and will be destroyed in next weeks and months. It's total disaster, and as I mentioned before, it is absolutely unprovoked. It can be justified by so-called Minsk agreements and recognizing independence of Donetsk and Lugansk Republic. I wonder who gave Russia a right to recognize the territories of independent state, and why Kremlin neglect sovereignty of Ukraine. What was the real threat? I'd like Mr. Sumsky to tell me what was the real threat from Ukraine, because we have had no real perspective of joining NATO in years. Indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Sovjan. Let me ask you a follow-up question, and after this, I will come to Dr. Sumsky, okay? Dr. Sovjan, so you've described the situation on the ground. It's very grave, very dire. This is life and death. These are dire figures and numbers, and the prospects look rather alarming and dangerous for all of you there. But let me ask, do you think this resistance that we're seeing from your country and leadership will be sustained? How does it feel on the ground? The resolve and the resistance committed for the long time, and then to what extent has the international assistance has been helpful? And could you tell us a little bit about that, Dr. Sovjan?
Yeah, of course, Ukrainians are united. We feel ourselves as the whole nation, and it's unprecedented in Ukrainian history. Before the war, Mr. Zelensky had support of about 27% of Ukrainians. In presidential polls, he was a leader, but as I mentioned, his support was about 1/3 of Ukrainian electorate. But after the war, according to last polls, more than 90% of Ukrainians support what Zelensky is doing. We may say that the threat from Russia was underestimated, and some preparations were not made as they had to be. But at the same time, after the beginning of the war, we see that Zelensky became a real leader of Ukrainian nation, and the whole free world is fond of how he behaved and how he resists in such a dramatic situation. And really, really very serious and comprehensive situation for the whole Ukraine. And I may say that Ukrainians will resist, and resisting is will become more and more, and Russia will face with very heavy losses, because the guerrilla war is to come, and even if we lost control over skies, the ground on the foots of Russian soldiers will burn, as well as their techniques.
Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned guerrilla warfare, so that implies a long-term resistance. I'll just come back to Dr. Sumsky. Dr. Sumsky, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, the question was raised about what did Ukraine do to elicit this invasion, and then in your view, from Russia. Is Russia in it for the long haul as well? How do you see this shaping up in the days ahead? Is it going to be a kind of a quick finish? Russia will try. Certainly, it seems to be going on longer than initially planned, perhaps. Dr. Sumsky?
I do not think that it will be a quick finish, but I still think that there is a well-elaborated strategic plan to go through this campaign, which becomes longer maybe than it could have been had we been dealing with a nation which we do not consider as close to us historically and culturally as Ukraine. That's number one. And I think a lot of care is taken to avoid damage where it can be avoided, but sometimes it can be avoided. For instance, in cases when sharpshooters and guns are placed on top of the buildings, and there is no other way to deal with them quickly than to shoot at the top part of the buildings. That we have seen on TV, by the way. I find it absolutely impossible to dispute every sentence pronounced by Dr. Vladimir, because actually this is what I think his presentation deserves. But I was particularly impressed by his claim that Russian troops are, how did he say it? He said that Russian troops are robbing houses and begging for food. This is not even propaganda. I think that this is simply nonsense. And as far as the strategic aspects of the situation is concerned, I leave it up to Dr. Vladimir to think and to express any thoughts he wants to express. But if he wants to an alternative point of view and not mine, I strongly advise to him to go and look at what TV channels in the NATO countries are now presenting to their audience as far as the dynamics of this situation are concerned. And these are former NATO commanders, by the way, and also people who are active in military service now. But what I would consider the most impressive statement so far coming from this quarters is an interview recorded a few days ago by Scott Ritter, who is the retired U.S. Marine colonel and a highly experienced intelligence officer who served as the chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, and who is actually responsible for disclosing that the pretensions of American Secretary of State Colin Powell that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq proved to be a fake, a hopeless fake. And so many other fakes which are circulating now and related to what what is happening in Ukraine will be disclosed very soon. You may be sure about that. But let me say one more thing, which I think is very important to emphasize here. At the end of the day, it's not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between Russia and the whole of NATO, and first and foremost, the United States. And if you want to call Ukraine in its present state by what I can consider its real name, it's a U.S. proxy. Lots of arguments may be presented to support that view, but I will limit myself to this statement.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sumsky. So, even Dr. Sumsky, even for us here in Thailand and Southeast Asia, when there's a kind of a big war like this, we're also wondering how did it happen? So, the question is not just from Ukraine, but it's just a kind of a common sense question and a puzzle, curiosity about why Ukraine? What did Ukraine do? Just a quick response from the Russian perspective, like what was the why invade Ukraine? What happened there?
I wonder what Dr. Vladimir will say if we remember that just a few days ago at the Munich conference in Germany, President Zelensky said that he would attempt to restore what he called the nuclear status of Ukraine. What is even more amazing is that I think everybody present in that audience of the Munich Security Conference represented states who are fully subscribed to the non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, they all applauded. And this gives you, all these people already knew that a war may take place. And they knew how scandalous and how provoking is Zelensky's statement. And they knew that they will not support Zelensky in terms of actual military intervention. Nevertheless, they were still teasing him into teasing Russians.
Okay, so what you're saying is that this attack against Ukraine is not just about Ukraine, but about larger forces. Okay, we'll take it. We'll come back to you, Dr. Sumsky.
May I say a few more words? This is basically about the fact that this is not just Americans. If you look at the group, and this is just to give you an idea how about the historical depth of what is happening. Among the most enthusiastic supporters of Zelensky, you see, for instance, Poland, the country who was ironically described as the 16th century superpower of Europe, which is a traditional enemy of Russia. There is Sweden, which fought against Russia and Peter the Great in the early 18th century on the grounds of contemporary Ukraine, and whose defeat actually resulted in a loss of a dominant power status in Northern Europe. There is Great Britain, which was involved in the great game with Russia throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, and is resurrecting the great game now. And of course, the United States, which is, I would say now, is the existential enemy of Russia.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Ukraine in this operation.
Okay. Evidently, you mentioned a list of grievances that Russia feels, and I think from Russia's perspective, and from us in Southeast Asia, we've just heard what you said about all these grievances. But I do still think, Dr. Sumsky, and I'm going to move now to Dr. Solojan. I'll just ask my colleagues, Dr. Jitipat, Ajahn Jitipat, and Ajahn Nathanan, just bear with us just for a few minutes. I'll still say that, these grievances were discussed, and, we even had articles written and taught in class, and we pay attention. But once this war started, as I said initially, it just the narrative just shifted track. Now it's about war. and it's about a war of one side against another side. And I think many people will say that there's no, clear and present and obvious reasons for the cause of this invasion. Dr. Sovjan, I'll just give you a couple minutes to reply. I mean, of course, there's different views. It's okay. From your view, what anything you want to say at this time?
Yes, I'd like to answer in some way to what Mr. Sumsky has said when he says that robberies of food magazines by Russian soldiers is fake. I may provide you with tens of videos from cameras. It's facts. But when Mr. Sumsky said that Mr. Zelensky during Munich conference several days before the war started, that Zelensky said something about that Ukraine is going to restore its nuclear arsenal, nuclear weapon. It's totally false. What was Zelensky saying about is the violation of Budapest Memorandum, under which in 1994 Ukraine abandoned, gave up the third arsenal of a nuclear weapon in the world. But instead, it didn't got any security guarantees from, as we may really see, because guarantees among the big state who guaranteed territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. After that, according to Budapest Memorandum, was Russia, and Russia violated it in 2014 when it annexed Crimea, and after when Russia invaded Ukraine in Donbass. And these skirmishes and war in Donbass started after Russia began to supply troops, supply weaponry, and money to its puppets in so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, and Russia was the side who fired this conflict during years and pushed Ukraine to implement Minsk agreements that were unimplemented because because according to these agreements, imagine Ukraine had to hold elections while not controlling its state border. Elections that couldn't match Ukrainian constitution and Ukrainian laws. And after that, only after those Russian puppets, separatists, according to these Minsk agreements, only after they could be elected and implemented into Ukraine, after that, Russia planned to control this region economically and control all the processes and to point even judges, local militia, etc. After all, Russia, all these 8 years, wanted to implement these Minsk agreements only to control Ukraine and prevent it from its European perspective. So it was quite complicated for every Ukrainian authority to implement Minsk agreements, but whether Russian leadership want to solve this problem, to solve this issue, and avoid death among so-called Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they should negotiate with Ukraine those agreements that could really solve the problem. The problem was not in just a paper. If you want to save people's life, you have to negotiate. The aim is not only some some agreement, but the result. And Ukraine was for the restoring, was for the real result, not a process, just a process that we may see now was used by Russia to invade Ukraine.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sobchan. Thank you very much. Look, we're going to come back to you and also to Dr. Sumsky. You mentioned the word negotiate. That's a key word going forward. So we're going to try to dig deeper into that. Very clearly, there are deep differences, I think, between Russia and Ukraine about the interpretation and the dynamics of how they see the 2013-2014 Minsk Agreement and also Minsk II. Let me just take some time now, a little bit, to allow my colleagues, Dr. Jitipat and Dr. Nathanan. Dr. Jitipat Bunkam is the associate professor at the Thammasat University across Bangkok, across town. He has just published a new book on the Thai foreign policy called A Genealogy of Bamboo Diplomacy, the Politics of Thai Detente with Russia and China. He is also a professor. He has lectured widely here at home and also elsewhere in the region. So now we're going to turn just a little bit of our attention to the consequences, the meanings, and the impact, impact and implications. I'll come to Dr. Jitipat first. I noticed, now the EU and NATO seem to be reinvigorated, imposing sanctions, and the rules-based international order seem to have been given a big boost in a way. I don't know. Is this a net damage to world order, Dr. Jitipat?
Thanks for Thanks for having me. Let me talk about origins and causes of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine first, and maybe I will touch upon your questions later. I think for many IR scholars, it is driven by various factors such as the deterioration in Russia-Ukraine relations, Putin's egoistic expansionism, or the West/NATO's fault. I think equally important is that the Ukraine war is fundamentally the result of an unfinished order settlement in the post-Cold War world in Europe. I have a couple main points. Let me begin with my five reflections on the state of war first. My first reflection is that this war is a war of choice, necessity. It is not inevitable. It can be avoidable in the first place. And we can say that both U.S.-Iraq war and Russia's war in Ukraine are imperialist wars. We should equally condemn Russia's Ukraine war as much as U.S.-Iraq war. My second reflection is that the Russian attack on Ukraine is not going as smoothly as Putin anticipated. Russian troops encounter limited military progress, logistic failure, and strategic miscalculation. And Ukrainian people fight back with strong anti-Russian sentiment and patriotism. Their civilian defense and resistance are widespread. In counter urban warfare, Russia could have an insurgencies on its hand in Ukraine if the war is prolonged. It is Russia's block-to-block warfare in Ukraine. So unlike the 5-day war with Georgia in August 2008, Ukraine war now is not short and brief like Putin initially wanted. My third reflection is that Russia's war turned out to be opposite to what Putin wants with regard to the European security architecture. An assault to Ukraine instead revitalized the spirit and solidarity of NATO. On the one hand, the US and NATO alliance imposed harsh financial sanctions on Russia, including cutting Moscow off the SWIFT international financial system. The list of sanction targets expanded, include the oligarchs and family members of Russian elites. On the other hand, the Ukraine wars, reverse what the US and NATO had failed to achieve in the past. From Obama to Trump, the US urged the NATO members to increase its military spending to 2% of their GDP in different ways. Russia's attack on Ukraine changes this game. My fourth reflection is that an onslaught of Western sanctions is humiliating Putin's regime at home. A number of Russian protesters gathered in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities chanting no to war. They do not fear that the police would detain them. Many of them do not fear the Putin regime anymore. It is likely that the anti-war sentiment could shift toward a broader anti-Putin movement. In this way, more intense police repression will follow. Today, Vladimir Putin is increasingly fighting three wars simultaneously, one in Ukraine, one in international community, and one at home. My fifth reflection is that the highest stake and concern is not yet about a nuclear war scenario, but it will come from a nuclear accident, which is also can be avoidable. Russia's war in Ukraine raised so-called Chernobyl incident. This is because on the first day of the attack, Russia has seized control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. On Friday, today's morning, a fire has reportedly broken out at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine, which is the Ukraine's largest nuclear plant. It is on fire, allegedly following shelling by Russian troops. This event might precipitate another worse nuclear disaster, which will definitely affect the whole European community, including Russia itself. Backed into a corner, Putin put his country's nuclear weapons on alert. The threat of nuclear escalation is real and now rising. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov denied that the Russian government would use nuclear weapons at this stage. However, international community and specifically Russia must take exceptional measures to avoid a nuclear catastrophes. And I think many scholars, including myself, fear that Putin's Russia could be tempted to turn towards nuclear weapons out of anger and frustration. This is why giving Putin a way out could avert catastrophe. This is not for Putin's sake, but more importantly for the sake of the global common interests, including Europe's and also Ukraine's. Against this backdrop, let me talk a little bit. Maybe we need to step back a little bit and ask the basic and fundamental question: why does this war come about in the first place? I do not think that there is one single factor that explains major events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some, such as liberal Michael Magful, argues from the individuals and domestic politics factors that if Putin is no longer the Russian president, Russia will be more democratic and peaceful. I quite disagree with this simple and simplified argument. I think major events happen for multiple reasons, and history has shown us that there is rarely monocausal. Let me highlight two broad causes for us. One is immediate, and the second one is the structural root causes, respectively. For the immediate causes, the Ukraine incident is a result of triple failures. One is the failures of Russia's coercive diplomacy. The Mediterranean highlight the fact that at first, initially, Putin's true goal might be to change the post-Cold War European security architecture rather than conquering Ukraine and annexing it in Russia. But however, this military leverage or bargaining to engage the U.S. to talk, or the European community to talk about Russia concern, security concern in Europe is not working. Putin himself made three unconditional demands: one, an end to NATO enlargement; two, no more NATO offensive weapon system in Europe; and three, the withdrawal of military infrastructure deployed in Eastern Europe after 1997. Russia's coercive diplomacy fails since the West would and could never have agreed to Putin's ultimatums. Two, the failures of Minsk Protocol, as my predecessors talk a lot about this. I will not talk about this in detail. The third is the failures of NATO and US to reassure Russian interests. The second set of explanation can be the structural and root causes of Russia-Ukraine war. I would like to highlight four contrasting and competing narratives or myths that shape and show the European and Russian players into the enduring conflicts in Ukraine. Based on fear and security dilemma, these myths have intensified the geopolitical anxieties and their rivaling imaginaries in this common neighborhood. It is a clash of narratives on the issues of European security. The four myths include, I will talk briefly, that one, Ukraine is not an independent state, but part of Russia's motherland. That is the first myth. The second myth is that the crisis is a civil war. internal one. The third is the war is Putin's one. And the fourth, the NATO has never broken promises of non-enlargement. The first two myths are Russia's problem, while the latter two are part of the European problems. Unless these fundamental myths are seriously addressed, debunked, and transcend, any diplomatic negotiations would become challenging, if not impossible. We learn from history, international history, that while economic issues can be dealt with, security guarantees can be given, and new deals can be signed. These mythical underpinnings of an unfinished order settlement in post-Cold War Europe are harder to be managed. The myths can only be solved by rewriting and rebuilding a new basis of legitimacy together. So let me conclude. The Russia-Ukraine war represents not the end of history, but the return of history. My first takeaway is that when we learn from international history, war as a human and relational phenomenon has often in ways unintended and unanticipated by its designer. Every so often, war is an outcome of miscalculation, missed chances, and unintended consequences. The Ukraine debacle today seems to follow this saga. My second takeaway is that if you look back to the point about the origins of the post-war, post-Cold War international order settlement, I think back in the early 1990s, many IR theorists saw Ukraine as if not the potential post-Cold War flashpoint for major conflict. This is not because of the NATO enlargement, which came in late. There are two main reasons. One is that Ukraine always sits at the strategic fault line between the East and the West. Kiev was pulled in both directions historically. Another reason is that Ukraine was the most important non-Russian republic in the Soviet Union. It was the largest, most populous, and economically vital. Both reasons suggest that Russia would have an incentive to reclaim the country, or at least keep Ukraine within Russia's sphere of influence. This fear is now becoming reality. Most notably, John Mearsheimer wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs in 1993 entitled The Case for Ukrainian Nuclear Deterrent. Mearsheimer argues at least four main points. One, Russia has a history of bad relations with Ukraine. Two, Ukraine cannot defend itself against a nuclear-armed Russia with conventional weapons. And three, no state, including the US, is going to grant a meaningful security guarantee. These first three points are to a large extent still intact and relevant to the current situation in the heartland of Europe. The fourth point seemed to be empirically wrong since the denuclearization happened in Ukraine. Lastly, my last takeaway is that to follow Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, who said that the UN, quote unquote, the United Nations was born out of war to end war. But today, that objective was not achieved. But we must never give up. We must give peace another chance. Following this, the world must give peace another chance to end this war in Ukraine now. I will stop here. In the next round, I would like to talk about maybe possible scenarios of war and peace and maybe strategic geoposition for Asia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ajahn Chittiphat. I'm already looking forward to your scenarios. That was a very packed, comprehensive, forward-looking, but also with a historical perspective. Thank you very much, very rich. I'll move to Ajahn Nathanan. Ajahn Nathanan, my colleague at the Faculty of Political Science International Relations Department at Chulalongkorn University. She's a Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor. She is the chair of Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor in Political Science, Chulalongkorn University. She is also Director of the Center for European Studies here at Chulalongkorn University. Ajahn Nathanan, what do you think? Your views, reflections, observations about the ongoing war, and how it might. What are the prospects ahead? How it might come to an end from your vantage point. Go ahead, Ajahn Nathanan. I think your microphone may be off. The tech team said. The microphone is off, Ajahn Nathanan. Okay. That's all right. David, I'll text you. Let me move back to Professors Dr. Sumsky and Dr. Zlobjan. So, Dr. Sumsky, I'll come back to you. I mean, from the ongoing discussions, the situation on the ground, very grave, very dire. And, from Russia's point of view, you've heard from my colleague, Janti Dipat, and, we in Thailand, we are far away. But I have to say that, the sentiments on the ground are not very favorable, towards the military invasion in Ukraine. Where do you think, under what conditions can this come to an end? What kind of negotiations, what would be satisfactory for Russia to have an exit strategy and in view of the war aim? So, Dr. Sumsky, what are the war objectives and what is the exit conditions?
Let me say first that from what we heard so far from both Dr. Volodymyr and Dr. Jetipat, I think the assessments of the abilities of President Putin and the abilities of the Russian generals to do what they are supposed to do in their professions, and Russian soldiers are not very balanced and very adequate. I mean, nobody in Russia has ever had an idea that that an operation in Ukraine will be anything reminiscent to the 5-day war in Georgia. This is ridiculous to think that these people cannot distinguish between what they're confronting in one case and in the other. I would basically like to say that since none of us is actually on the ground in Ukraine except Dr. Volodymyr, I would suggest that we stick to the view of what is going there as an event in progress, or a work in progress, if you wish, and reserve our final judgments, which I think in both cases, in the cases of both respected doctors, are too clear-cut and too predetermined. Let's refrain from such judgments until we see the final result. When we see it, I do not know, and nobody knows, but at the very least, I think it will take a few weeks to come to some more concrete conclusions than we are able to come now. On the objectives of the war, I would say that 3 of them were stated quite openly. One of them is demilitarization of Ukraine. In other words, the destruction of that militarized system which has developed in Ukraine, and that it's militarized can be proven by the recent efforts to create military machinery, offensive military machinery in Ukraine. Although Dr. Volodymyr said that this work isn't finished, much of it has been already done, and what has been done is justifying enough the view that this militarization of Ukraine is consequently carried out with full support from its Western allies. Number 2, it's denazification. You hear today many claims that there is no Nazism in Ukraine. I would refer here to the case of Odessa, which is, the famous case of burning alive about 50 people in one of the major. It's called officially the Palace of Trade Unions. It's an absolute tragic history story which was neglected and bypassed by all the human rights monitoring organizations all around the world and in the West, of course. The destruction of and vandalization of of Soviet military memorials, and of course the rebirth of uh, of um, of organizations whose origins go back to the 1930s and to the Hitler's occupation of Ukraine. So, demilitarization, denazification, and on that basis, neutralization of Ukraine. These are the objectives of this operation. And these are not military objectives. And nobody thinks that these objectives can be achieved by military means alone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sumsky. We've read this in the news too about the some of the objectives, including the demilitarization, denazification. This is the thing, when we read about, I think from our vantage point here, we just don't quite understand this concept of the denazification, the demilitarization. That's something that we can get a grip on. But Dr. Sumki, let me bring in my colleague, Ajahn Nathanand, Professor Nathanand, whose audio is back on now. We'll just take a round, maybe Ajahn Nathanand, your observations, and look at Asia. China, China has criticized, is against the sanctions, but has not really endorsed the invasion. ASEAN voted in the United Nations General Assembly on the resolution condemning Russia for aggression against Ukraine. A very mixed vote. 8 in favor, 2 abstentions from Laos and Vietnam. On the other hand, Singapore is at the forefront, also imposing sanctions on Russia, against Russia. So very mixed responses from Southeast Asia. I think Japan very clear, imposing sanctions. I think South Korea also co-sponsored the resolution. So very mixed views around Asia. Ajahn Nathanand, you teach European studies, and you also write and speak about ASEAN. How about some observations and reflections about this war from you? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Titinan. Okay, you can hear me now, right? I apologize for the technological disruption. Thank you, Isis, again, and my colleague, Professor Titinan. As Professor Titinan introduced, I'm more on the EU follower. And I would like to relate myself to the issue of Ukraine, because in 2010, I did research on Ukraine, Thailand as one choice of emerging market. I got funded by Chulalongkorn University. And that time in 2010 is the final year of President Viktor Yushchenko, the one who led Orange Revolution in 2004. So that time, I'm really happy and optimistic on the democratization and economic liberalization of Ukraine at that time. And this incident, this invasion, is really upset me. Okay, I try to tell you frankly. And from now on, my reflection, when I say the word Russia, it means Kremlin. It doesn't mean Russian scholars or Russian civil society, because I believe that the non-government Russian did not support this aggression of Kremlin. Okay, so we need to divide the term when listening to me. Before we are going to Asia, which is going to relate to the Asian impact and global impact, I would like to relate to Europe first, but it won't take much time because I teach Europe for my entire 20 years life in Jula. I think this military acts by Kremlin, Russia, creates European implications and European studies that I never witnessed before. The first one is that EU becomes or steps up to be the security actor that EU never be. Before, the EU was termed as civilian power subordinated to the US, or sometimes we use normative power to impose values of democracy, human rights in Thailand, in Myanmar. But this time, this invasion witnessed the EU solidarity, and this corresponded to the EU goals to be an ever closer union, or to be the political community in which the foreign and security policy will be harmonized. And apart from bilateral efforts by individual EU member states to help Ukraine, even in terms of weaponry, the words that in the past that people always coin the EU, that the EU is an economic giants, political dwarfs, or military worms. I think we should rethink this term, and how Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, how the Foreign Minister of the EU, or the CFSP, HRVP, reflects on thinking about using the EU money. Even the founding treaties prevented to buy weapons to Ukraine. I think that it's the first time. I mean, in the entire EU history after the Second World War, that EU will step up these security roles. And the second thing about European implications is that after President Zelensky filling the application form, we've seen that enlargement might take place, even if it will take 10 years. However, it might be fast, because if we consider the enlargement during the 80s, in which the EC accept Greece, Spain, and Portugal in order to prevent the left wing domestically in those countries. So I think this might be not long, like nearly a decade. And this is very challenging, because when you have enlargement process, it's quite a big thing. And then the third thing that I would like to reflect, and it's worried me, because in the news we know that there were over a million of refugees take place after the invasion. However, I would like to draw out that actually the refugee could go up to 3 millions, because in Ukraine during the peaceful time, Ukraine already absorbed 1.5 million refugees. The first group is from the previous Crimea resident after the 2014 annexation. And then the second is Afghanistan refugee. The third one is Muslim Tatar. And then the fourth group is the Belarus the Belarus who opposing the authoritarian regime of President Lukashenko. So the EU will take the largest influx ever, even more than the Syrian refugee war this time. And you see the solidarity that the EU member states, and also the plus, like the one in the EEA or in the EFTA, willing to absorb this burden, compared to the past, that the EU member state has a disagreement in how many refugees they are going to get. So this is my reflections on Europe. And then when coming to Asia, I would like to relate that. Well, the only way now to reduce the casualty is that we need to have a ceasefire, and then I would like to point out the mediators, right? So the first generation of mediator, we've seen France, President Macron, been to President Putin. However, it's not really successful because the invasion took place, and France, with the Gaullist policy itself, also sending military weapons to Ukraine as well. So it's come to the Asian power. We see China, and well, Ukraine might not trust China, but however, if you think the other way around, China depends a lot on both Russia and Ukraine in terms of food security. That's why China expressed herself to be the mediator, because China, even the vast, even having the vast land, they could not produce agricultural products much in terms of wheat and maize, and they import a lot from Ukraine. That part. So I think these economic ties will bring in China. But how to make the Ukraine trust this process? I'm still I still cannot find a way out, but we can discuss this on the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janatanan. Thank you very much. You brought out some of the points to press forward with, including the refugee crisis. And you also mentioned that this war and the consequences, the impact, has actually strengthened EU solidarity, especially with regard to the refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and it's just beginning. And I think it will be, as you mentioned, probably worse than what the EU has seen in years, right? Even Syria was not this dire, and it was not so much next door. You also mentioned about the ceasefire conditions and the EU and NATO expansion, EU enlargement, NATO eastward expansion. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this. By the way, now I just say I invite comments and questions from the floor. Please feel free to post them for our audience members and participants into the Facebook Live platform, and then we'll field the questions as they come in. This is, I'll post this to Dr. Sovjan, and then I'll come to Dr. Sumsky, and then Dr. Chitipat. But what's happening now is actually, war has a tendency to incur and generate unintended consequences and outcomes. And one of them, it seems to be that now, Russia may have intended to stop NATO eastward expansion and maybe EU enlargement, but now EU enlargement may be seen as imperative, that is now even more pressing for countries like Ukraine, and even Sweden and Finland seeing this war. Maybe they will see an imperative as well, the advisability of joining NATO. So it may be just the counterproductive or just the opposite of what we might have, what Russia might have expected, stopping enlargement and expansion. But in fact, enlargement and expansion maybe will have more steam, will have more momentum. Dr. Sofjan, so with the war now, and I know that from the news that President Zelensky has asked for immediate membership of EU. I don't know how that is being considered, but would this now convince Ukraine even more to join EU and NATO, not less, even more because of this war? Dr. Sofjan, the floor is yours. And you can also react to any of the previous earlier comments and points that were raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Appealing for membership in the EU and support from European Parliament is a sign of support of Ukraine among Western community. But of course, we understand that this membership, at least now, is a far perspective, because at first we should renew our economy, and it will cost billions and billions of dollars. So we need a Marshall Plan at first, and then we will see how far we can move on this track of EU membership. As well as NATO, pretending to become a NATO member, even as it was before the war. NATO refused to provide Ukraine even with a NATO membership action plan, and that was a clear sign that West was willing to hear Russian demands, and there was no really real perspective of Ukraine to become a NATO member. So when I hear Russian demands about demilitarization, I cannot really understand what was the real threat for Russia, because now we try to stop Russian troops with Soviet armor. All our anti-aircraft warfare is Soviet. And we had and all our aircrafts also are from the Soviet era. They are more than 30 or 40 years, and this is our main weaponry we try to resist. So the only useful weapon that was provided by West is anti-tank missiles, Stinkers, Javelins, and Law, and so on. But I wonder how these anti-tank missiles threatened Russia. What was a real threat for Russian forces? Because NATO didn't pretend to provoke Russia in Ukraine, and it's quite obviously. Also, if we look at marine dimension, Russian fleet is dominant in this region, especially after annexation of Crimea. And the clear evidence of this was the absence of common NATO strategy towards Black Sea. Even Black Sea members of the NATO, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, had no clear common policy on how to deter Russia. And as we know, Turkey has its own position towards bilateral policy with Russia that is quite another comparing to common position of NATO member countries. Also, the issue of denazification is also very I may say that it is also a freak deny of freak because Russian actions really provoke provoke Ukrainians to become more radical and apply to nationalist ideology. But if we look at results of elections to our parliament, you can't see there any radical right-wing party. And these so-called neo-Nazi elements is they don't have real support among Ukrainians. How can we say about denazification in country which president is Jewish, which former vice president, prime minister was Jewish, and this is absolutely nonsense. In Russian position in Putin's world, in his freak world, denazification means de-Ukrainization, and it's how we reflect it. We Ukrainians reflect Putin's so-called denazification as de-Ukrainization of Ukraine. He tried to to destroy our culture. I can't understand how Russia wants to pretend to defend its culture, its language, and so on by shelling Ukrainian cities, by killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and how Russia can justify its aggression through Odessa tragedy. Because only yesterday, aircraft missile hit a civilian building, and 35 Ukrainians were killed. How you can justify your aggression? And it's very hard to imagine how this can be compared. If Russia tried to apply it to the situation in Donbass, and we hear from Russians that Ukrainians were shelling Donbass for 8 years. But wait, let's look at data provided by OSCE, United Nations, the data on casualties among citizens, among local residents. During 2019-2018, death casualties were among 30 people from both sides, from Ukrainian and separatist side. Today, only after a week of war, the casualties are the number of casualties is the same that it was during all 8 years. I don't understand how it will stop the conflict. It's nonsense.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slavjan. Dr. Slavjan, you mentioned the Marshall Plan. I mean, one point that I think we have not begun to really look at is the requirement for reconstruction and rehabilitation, because this is just still in the early days. But I would imagine that there will be a lot of damages, a lot of need for recovery and reconstruction that will require a lot of capital and funding. We're coming around to the last half hour or so, and I want to turn this discussion a little bit into forward-looking ways. You mentioned, Dr. Slavjan, about the need to how to stop this conflict, this war. Ajahn Titipat, may I come to you for some of your scenarios? I mean, how can we achieve some kind of a ceasefire? And then if you can mention a few. I mean, I also have a few. There are different suggestions, and then we'll come to Dr. Sumsky about his perspective. Ajahn Titipat, please.
Thank you, Ajahn Titinan. I think I will try to talk about war and peace scenarios, how the war might proceed. Well, one fact is that amid the fog of war, it is difficult to see and anticipate what would happen next. However, I think three broad possible scenarios might play out. One is limited and short war. The second is long war. And the third one is diplomatic solution. The first one, I think, I hope it will end soon. But at least at first, I think the Kremlin might consider this scenario. So under this scenario, the disarmament and demilitarization of Ukraine should be done in quite a short time. But so far, the incident in Ukraine does not go as it is anticipated in the first place. It's go quite badly for Russia. Okay. The second scenario is long war scenario, which is really bleak and bad for all. Okay, for European, for Russian, and also for the Ukrainian as well. We might consider this scenario, which include some possible options, but I think it's also not quite good for many players in European politics. One is foreign imposed regime change. The second one is state aid or the annexation of Ukraine, which is not the case according to Putin's announcement in the first place. Imperial overstretch that might include the formal control of the whole near abroad. And lastly, it might broaden the great power war in Europe, and this might escalate into a world war. This option is still less likely than many anticipated. However, everything is still possible. If you think the call in a call with Russian President Putin, French President Emmanuel Macron highlight that the worst is to come, and Putin, according to Macron, Putin tends to take control of the whole Ukraine. And right now, I think Ukraine's parliament has approved a bill to allow the seizures of assets or property in Ukraine owned by Russia or Russian citizens. I think this decision is vital and will definitely frustrate Russia more. Another point, in the long war, we haven't seen that a nuclear war is considered as a possible option. As I mentioned before, that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov toned down the risk of nuclear war, but we don't know 100% sure that this will be the case. So it leads to another point that that when Russia is pushed or under pressure, okay, or corner in the war and international community, that might be quite risky, highly risky for the international community and European politics as well. This leads me to the third scenario, okay, about the peaceful and diplomatic solution. One thing is clear that negotiation on ceasefire between the Russians and Ukrainians is still underway with not much progress. The good sign, okay, happened yesterday. Both sides agreed to temporarily ceasefires in some areas, not the whole area, but some areas, to allow civilian evacuations. Given the threat of nuclear escalation, I think it is why giving Putin a way out could avert nuclear catastrophe. Back into corner, Putin's Russia could use any means necessary to win this war. The key question is whether the West will offer what some diplomats refer to as an off-ramp, an exit of a major highway and a face-saving deal with Russia. This option is quite challenging because the West war rhetoric and anti-Russian liberal sentiment is all around. However, I think the China factor is now more important than ever. It can play a reliable and powerful mediator in the Ukraine-Russia war. Beijing has economic, political leverage and bargaining power with both countries, which I think it might be possible in the near future. And these three scenarios are all possible. It seems that the war is now not quite limited. And we can see that when Russia intend to disarm and maybe take control of the whole Ukraine, I think that might be, the war might be prolonged. If it is prolonged and even Putin can declare victory, Russia will face an insurgencies and civil resistance from Ukraine as well. The risk of another Afghanistan is highly likely. So this unavoidably intensify human catastrophe and humanitarian crisis as we now encounter.
Yes, thank you very much. Those are, roughly, I think the main scenarios depend on the battlefield dynamics. Situation on the ground is very fluid. It's day to day, now second week. But I also want to explore a little bit the role of China. China, Myanmar had a military coup. China was not too happy, but it did not, has not, and will not abandon the Myanmar military. I think in a similar way, we have not seen, the Chinese official announcements have not endorsed this invasion at all, but at the same time, it has opposed sanctions. We do know that President Putin visited Beijing, visited President Xi Jinping in the opening of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. So I think there was some discussions, some understanding. So China, I do agree with you, Untitled Chapter, has a potential kind of mediating role and leverage, unlike any other major power. And in fact, if you look at the Chinese official statements and position, they always emphasize this kind of principled respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty and so on. So this is not consistent with what's happening with the violation of sovereignty in Ukraine. So China's role could be crucial and possibly vital for some kind of a negotiation and diplomatic solution down the road. I'll come to Dr. Sumsky. Dr. Sumsky, I asked earlier about the war objectives, but also if Mr. Putin, if President Putin is cornered or he doesn't under more pressure, the war doesn't achieve the aims. What could be an exit strategy for him? What could be a way out? What would be required for this invasion to cease and to achieve some kind of a ceasefire and dialing back some kind of negotiations and way out? What do you think?
Dr. Titian, I think your question has been just answered by Dr. Vladimir, who said that Putin is a freak. If this is true, then I do not think he would be able to do any kind of rational choice of a way out or a continuation of the military strategy that he is already practicing in Ukraine. I mean, he's a nobody if he's a freak. So there's no point discussing that.
No, I mean, in your view, not what anybody else has said. Given what you've seen and what you're seeing, what could be an exit strategy, or how could be conditions for ceasefire to begin with? In your own view, Dr. Sumsky.
Let me tell you this. And this is my personal judgment, and I do not impose it on any other participants in our conversation. Of all the political leaders who are now active on the global arena, Putin is the most rational, the most calculating, the most competent, and the most cautious. He said, by the way, that the decision to go into military action was a bad decision, but there was no other way to solve the problem of neutralizing the threat that may come to Russia in case if Ukraine does, Ukraine is not a member of NATO officially, but it's a de facto member of it. Let's face it. So if offensive weapons are placed on the territory of Ukraine, and we're talking about nuclear missiles actually, then the flight time to Moscow will be just, if this is hypersonic missiles, the flight time to Moscow may be reduced just to 4 or 5 minutes, which will not allow Russia to do a retaliatory strike. And in that sense, it is absolutely unacceptable. This is something Putin openly said on TV when he was explaining the reasons for going into this military operation. And this is something you have to consider when you evaluate how big is the degree of consistency which may be displayed on that occasion, not just by Putin, but by the Russian generals, the Russian politicians who have been all involved. What Putin has decided is not just his personal idea. It was done after an extensive consultation with all possible sources of qualified opinion on that. So let me just say that I do not think that the prospect of China's mediating in this conflict is very realistic. And I also tend to think that when President Xi and Putin met in Beijing on for the opening of the Olympics, all of the plans which are implemented now were already finished, and Putin most probably. I do not know how detailed it was and in what particular form this message was brought, but it was brought to President Xi. Interestingly, right after the operation started, Putin called on Prime Minister Modi of India. And then everybody said that Modi was, for some reason, the only politician to whom this message was brought. I cannot imagine that before that, but in a quiet and absolutely unpublic way, it was not brought to China. And not to China as a whole, but to its top leader. Let me also quickly summarize. It may be useful for the final period of our discussion what was said here, as I understood it. So my partners in this discussion, I think, are all more or less sure that Russia is ill prepared for the military action it has taken, and it is doing very badly on the Ukrainian fronts. That Russia will be frustrated and eventually may realistically have a regime change. So it will be Russia minus Putin or minus the whole state machinery which is operating under Putin. That EU will be more united and stronger than ever before. That NATO will continue to expand. That Ukraine may even prevail in this whole conflict, and in the absence of Russia, because it will be defeated as a competitor, will become a major provider of grain for China. So, can you comment on these conclusions which I'm making?
This is some of the points that have been mentioned. I think, Dr. Sumsky, I think we all have kind of different data points, and certainly, as I mentioned in the very beginning, it's a very highly charged environment. I would say that the war, ongoing war, is perceived in different ways, and it's not being perceived, I think, by and large, very favorably around here where I sit, and I think in this region. And you can get that from the reflected in the United Nations General Assembly vote, just a couple of days ago. So that was a very overwhelming kind of opinion, if you will, international opinion, mostly against, condemning Russia for this resolution. I want to be a little bit constructive here. I want to come to the final part of this discussion. I know is very sensitive. There are a lot of raw feelings, but Dr. Sobjan, in Myanmar, next door to Thailand, there was a military coup a year ago, and since then there's been a kind of a nationwide revolt and increasingly armed opposition against the military in Myanmar, and it becomes like a guerrilla warfare, attrition warfare, and it seems it's going to go on for a long time. Do you see this in the Ukrainian context at all? In the coming days, maybe Russia could maybe come out on top in the battlefields, but then face a kind of a guerrilla warfare that goes on and on. Is that kind of resolve and determination on the part of the Ukrainian people? Dr. Sobjan.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I have heard some estimations from Western analytics as well, and they predict long-term warfare in Ukraine for years or even decades. But I think that it is not clear estimate, because there are some factors, and I may mention them. At first, Russia can pay so high military price for advance in Ukraine, and I think that Russia will not advance in Western Ukraine because these territories are. These territories has very strong belief against Russia, and historical roots towards World War II also are very strong there, where Ukrainian insurgent army was active during 40s of former century, and I think that Russia will avoid entering Western Ukraine. Also, I may say that sanctions is a really big leverage, and these sanctions that were imposed by the Western countries, and that sanctions that will come soon. This is a real disaster for Russian economy. International sanctions are gotten Russia. Russia being expelled from organizations, sports, culture, etc. And it is a point that it is impossible for Kremlin to tell for its citizens that it's all fine. I mean that Putin spent tens of billions of dollars in sport, in image of Russia, and now all this is totally eliminated. Russian sport clubs are out of organizations, and it means a real disaster for all Russian culture and sport. Also, crucial role in Ukrainian conflict and its developments play the volume of Western resistance. I mean, weaponry that West provides towards Ukraine. As for now, the biggest volumes are anti-tanks missiles, fire and forget systems. That is very useful for guerrilla war, but what we desperately need is anti-aircraft warfare. At first, to prevent casualties among citizens. Because if we look at what is going on in Chernihiv, in Kharkiv, it is total disaster for local population, because Russian planes hit civilian buildings, and tens, more than 100 casualties a day. It's awful. Also, many will depends whether or not NATO should implement no-fly zone over Ukraine. As for me, I don't believe in such development, because obviously it would mean the conflict between NATO and Russia. That means that we will on the brink of the World War III, and I think that Russian leadership is quite inadequate to use even a nuclear weapon. Also, there are factors that tells me that the situation will become even worse, because Putin don't want to negotiate with Ukraine as an equal. He puts only ultimatum. And when I hear from Mr. Sumsky about threat towards Russia on the perspective of missiles that could be placed in Ukraine, I wonder why Russia didn't seek any agreement with the United States on intermediate range and shorter range missiles. Such agreement could expel Ukraine from positioning such weapon on Ukrainian soil, and also we all Ukrainians and every Ukrainian government does not want to become a target for Russian missiles. So it's obviously that Ukraine would never pretend to place such weaponry on its soil. So this justification is just freak. It's nonsense. I mean that put in place only ultimatums on the table. Negotiations that are currently holding in Belarus is a gimmick. I mean that Kremlin is sending second-tier negotiators. For example, Mr. Medinsky is leading Russians on these negotiations, and he is a former minister of the culture. I wonder whether it is the real level of representative who may provide such an vital negotiations. So, to my point of view, Putin used this time during negotiations to provide the military supplies and prepare even for worse aggression. Overall, Putin is driven by a nationalist vision of restoring Russian Empire, and I don't think that West may pressure him on this stage, and that means that the only strength in the world that can pretend from things become even worse is China. For me, it's obviously that Putin told Mr. Xi about his decision to invade Ukraine, and China knew about the situation. There are many publications in Western press that Americans provided some satellite images and even data about war build-up amongst Ukrainian borders before the war, and asked China to make some impact on Putin and to prevent him from invading Ukraine. But from my perspective, China is not interested in long-term war because it will undermine world economy. It would provoke uncertainty and will harm its economical strategy, especially One Belt, One Road project. So in this dimension, I think that soon China will play a more active role, and this is the from this point, Russia will have to negotiate, and some peaceful agreements could be found. I think that from Ukraine's perspective, neutral status is option that Ukraine may accept.
Okay, Dr. Sofjan, thank you very much for your remarks, comments, and views and observations. I'm going to wrap it up this way. I'm just going to have a quick round. Dr. Sumsky, I'll come to you just for just a quick round so you have an input. And then I want to wrap up by giving the last few minutes to my colleagues, Dr. Chitipat and Dr. Natanan. Dr. Sumsky, you're an expert on Southeast Asia. Remember 11 years ago, there was Thailand, Cambodia had a border skirmish over the Pravihan temple complex. And it was about April 2011. And you must remember that well. And in the end, 20 people died. And cluster bombs were used. And it was pretty nasty at that time, very controversial, and it had to do with Thai domestic politics, Cambodian domestic politics at that time. So the Thai mindset, as you can relate, I'm sure, was about the lost territories. The lost territories used to belong to Siam, Thailand. But if you ask Cambodians at that time, they would say, and today they would say, they're the ones, a small country, subjugated by either Thailand or Vietnam, all through their history. So they have all these grievances, and they're the underdog being pushed around by a bigger country. So the longer that conflict went on, the more reputational damage Thailand incurred. So in the end, as you know, ASEAN kind of helped mediate it a little bit, and the situation calmed down, and a ceasefire was achieved, and then we went back to kind of a normality. But my point in asking this is, when you have a bigger country having a conflict with a smaller country, the bigger country doesn't look good. Just like Thailand did not look good 11 years ago against Cambodia. So, Dr. Sumsky, as a last remark from you, what would it take to kind of have a ceasefire or put a stop to it? Where's the stopping point here for Russia?
I think the talking points are basically those which I already outlined, although they may seem strange to you, but they sound very relevant in the Russian context. I think that sooner or later we will have peace again. It always comes after the wars, but this is, of course, the best case scenario if we exclude the possibility of tensions further going up, which should also be considered as a possibility. Since I would not be given the floor again, I'd like to say that this was very educational for me. Although I have to tell you that although you reminded several times that the region is very critical towards Russia, I know that pretty well. I do my homework, and I'm reading all possible sources of news and information to update myself. But this roundtable, I will tell you frankly, added something else to my understanding about the mood towards Russia, about the way people think, and even the people whom I considered thinking differently. So thank you very much for exposing me to that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a good way to have your last remark. Thank you. And hey, Professor Titipat and Professor Nathanand, Ajahn Titipat, the scenarios, short and long, it looks longer than short now. It looks to be longer than shorter now. And, the escalation can be very dangerous. But do you see, what can we have for the mechanisms to for a safety valve or some kind of a mechanism to prevent escalation from getting out of control? Just very quickly, I mean, in your view, as the last 1 minute or so, what would be the best way forward from your observation from afar, not a party to the conflict?
Thank you, Ajahn Titinan. I think the best case scenario is diplomatic solution. Okay, that everyone talk and then end the ceasefire first, and then we start negotiation for the real issue, for the real things that need to be think about. In particular, the rewriting of the European security architecture. Okay, that is more inclusive to not only Europe, U.S., Ukraine, but also to Russia. Okay, because in order to solve and to guarantee, have a security guarantee for Russia in the long term, I think we need to think about the prospect of NATO enlargement, which I think from Russian point of view, I think this is one, NATO enlargement is seen as a direct threat to Russia, and second, I think there's common knowledge in Russia that there is a broken promise from U.S., NATO, and so on about the not 1 inch eastward position, okay, promised by the U.S., the former U.S. Leaders. So I think that's the thing. Another point, I think NATO expansion. I think it seemed to be another point, and one possible solution might be so-called neutrality for Ukraine. Looking from afar, neutrality is not bad per se, okay, and it might leave a room for more cooperation, more reconstruction in the wider European security architecture in the future. So this might be the case about the model of Finlandization or neutrality. Okay, that might be the case. But right now, I think when the war rhetoric is ongoing and the anti-Russian liberal sentiments are widespread around the world, I think it's not quite a good thing, okay, for all stakeholders to sit together and talk. So I think we might need to go to solve that kind of short-term and long-term situation. But still, the best case scenario is diplomatic solution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ajahn Thitipat. The best case scenario also relies on the time duration. The sooner the better. I'm afraid that the longer this goes on, the best case will be a moving goalpost. What you mentioned about the status of Ukraine, I think the longer this war goes on, neutrality for them might not be an option. Anyway, lots more to discuss. Jonathan, last word for you.
Okay.
EU coming out of this war and crisis. The crisis will outlast the war, by the way. The war will end sometime, but the crisis, I think, will kind of linger. Do you think EU will come out of this? How will they come out of this? A lot stronger, a lot more challenged. The sanctions that have been imposed, by the way, I noticed European countries also suffering from the sanctions as well. You think they can sustain them, and you think that the EU will come out of this stronger? Last words from you.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't agree more that this sanction at first is strike Russia badly, but it will boomerang back anyhow, especially if we take that there are 4 items in the sanction field: food, freight, and finance. And especially feel not only Europe suffer, Asia will suffer a lot, especially ASEAN, because our ASEAN states are the export driving countries, and we need oil to run the machine, not only to fill the car. So it's going to impact us. Finance as well. That's why we heard the news that Russian bank going to collapse, but it will bounce back to European financial market as well. And also the globalization means the freight was disrupted. So international trade also in stagnant period. So I think that we need to end this as soon as possible in order to proceed our normal lives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, for our speakers in Moscow and Kiev, you can see that sitting here in Southeast Asia, ASEAN is a region of 650 million people and more than $3 trillion GDP combined. And you can see that we are very concerned. It affects us here all the way in Thailand, all the way in Southeast Asia, and all over the world. So I think if you ask anyone around here and in the region, we all want to see some kind of peace as soon as possible coming out of this war somehow. So please do know that it affects all of us, and we do care. And I think that this discussion shows some of the regional, local sentiments towards the war, and we all would like to see peace as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Dr. Sumsky, Dr. Sulovjan, Ajahn Thitipat, Ajahn Nathanan. Thank you for joining us. Also, our audience participants and members. Thank you very much.